Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. Today is a very special day for the Philosophy of Private Law network created by the University Adolfo Ibáñez, the University Externado of Colombia, and the University of Girona. And the reason is that the speaker in this last session of our seminars program is Professor Ernest Weinrib. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, and he's one of the most influential scholars in private law theory. In my view, he has made the most significant contribution to the elucidation of the very concept of private law, that is, in revealing what exactly makes private law to be private, what is private about private law. To see the relevance of his contribution, we have to keep in mind that at the time he started working on these issues, private law theory was a bit chaotic. Some became fascinated by the economics perspective, while others felt puzzled by them. However, most people rejecting the economic view had a very fuzzy idea about the proper way to build an account of private law that at the same time reflected those features that are familiar to the participants of the practice and in general to any person with some experience in the field, and that presented a morally plausible alternative to the principle of efficiency. Corrective justice was like an obvious candidate, but the problem was that no one seemed to know exactly what corrective justice is about. It was funny because people start calling corrective justice to any principle that made sense to them. Yet this creativity triggered a very rich debate among different conceptions of corrective justice and also different views about private law. But these agreements were pervasive for a long time during the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s. In that context, Professor Weinrib's contribution played a key role. The work that culminated with the publication of his book, The Idea of Private Law in 1995, brought some order to the debate. He developed a view of corrective justice that integrated two powerful ideas. First, from Aristotle, he took the idea that private law relations are correlatively structured. That was important for the identification of the pattern of reasoning and justification that was distinctive of private law. Second, he saw that Kantian right expressed the normativity inherent in the relationship of the parties. By combining Aristotle and Kant in this way, Professor Weinrib provided a solid ground for taking private law seriously, for thinking about private law in its own terms, as he says from time to time. Even if the debate continued for a while, eventually the discipline reached some point of maturity. This is shown by the fact that some theses, such as the bilaterality of private law, are not questioned anymore. So at least among those who to practice a non-consequentialist view of private law theory. In this way, deep disagreements turned into more domestic disagreements, less fundamental. This meant a huge progress in our understanding of private law. All subsequent non-economic developments in private law theory work within the framework set by Professor Weinrib. Today, Professor Weinrib will present a chapter of his forthcoming book entitled Reciprocal Freedom, Private Law and Public Right. In this chapter, he addresses in a detailed way the relationship between corrective justice and distributive justice. How these two forms of justice that are immanent and in the private-public divide while remaining distinct fit together in a coherent understanding of justice. Professor Weinrib, it is really a pleasure for us to have you here today. Let's hope that the next time we can meet, we can meet face to face. And thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And it is your time now.
Good. Thank you very much, Diego. And again, thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to have a dialogue with scholars in so many different parts of the world. So what I want to do in the next 40 minutes or so is four things. First of all, just briefly outline what the project of this book is. Then go over the corrective justice setup so one can appreciate the point of departure for this chapter. And in that connection, I want to review the material that I distributed, the page I distributed entitled 14 Theses about corrective justice. Then third, I want to turn to the content of this chapter and talk about the normative place of distributive justice. And then fourth, I want to talk briefly, I hope, about the conception of unity that is at play in this chapter, and I think has to be at play more broadly within a theory of rights. That is, that it's a unity by conceptual sequence. So that's the plan, and I'll try to accomplish that to the extent that I can, while staying within the time limits that Diego set out. So let me say a word, first of all, about the project of the book. As Diego mentioned, the idea of private law, and here I have to thank Diego for arranging for a Spanish translation of that work. The idea of private law set out a theory of private law focused on the law of torts, where many of the controversies about the nature of private law had taken place in the 1970s and 1980s, at the time that I was writing the articles that were preliminary to that book. That book dealt mostly, not exclusively, but mostly with tort law. And then in a subsequent book, Corrective Justice, I tried to extend the analysis of corrective justice to a wide range of other areas of private law, as well as a different set of problems. So by other areas, I mean unjust enrichment, the law of unjust enrichment, the law of remedies, the law of property, as well as the law of contracts. So it was an attempt to show that the idea of corrective justice had wide application in the legal doctrine of different areas of private law. That it wasn't that people often spoke of corrective justice as a theory of tort law. And I have to say that from the beginning, I never thought of it that way at all. I thought of it as a part of a theory of private law. And it took some time to convince people, to the extent that I was able to, that that's what it actually was. That until the idea of private law was published, it was very rare for anybody, at least in the English-speaking world, to talk about the theory of private law, as opposed to the theory of contract law, the theory of tort law, and so on. But throughout those years of publishing those two books and talking about the ideas in those two books, people kept on asking me questions about public law and what the relationship between private law and public law was. And I kept on saying, look, that's a different project. That's a different, let's get the private law side of this established first, and then the other is a different idea. And this book, this new book, Reciprocal Freedom, Private Law, and Public Right, is actually an attempt to turn to that question, to talk about the connection between corrective justice, private law conceived of as corrective justice, and public law. There's a lot that could be said about this, and I'm only dealing in this book with three subjects, which are the topics that I was most frequently questioned about. That is the relationship to distributive justice. People would often ask me, well, you're justifying tort law in a way. Does that mean tort law has to exist, or can tort law be replaced by a scheme of administrative compensation? So that was one question. Another question that frequently came up, especially from scholars in the civil law tradition, was what the connection was between private law and constitutional law. And I remember being at a conference on the law of unjust enrichment, and one very prominent South African scholar, and I was talking about unjust enrichment from the perspective of corrective justice. And one prominent South African scholar came up to me and said, I accept your theory. Your theory makes a lot of sense. It's very tight, very integrated theory. But the reason I can't ultimately accept it is because we in South Africa have a strong constitutional mandate to introduce constitutional principles into private law. And that blurs the private law, public law distinction that he said to me, you so strongly insist upon. So I thought that in the light of that and other comments, and because I thought it was an intrinsically interesting subject, I should also deal with the connection between private law and constitutional law and focus on the application of constitutional rights in private law that was pioneered in the Distributive in Germany, but has spread throughout most, but not all of the world, but is a common feature of liberal democracies. And the third question that I wanted to address was the question of the connection between private law and the rule of law, which is especially perplexing in the common law jurisdictions, because it seems as if in private law, judges are creating norms retroactively, which seems to be in violation of the rule of law. And so I wanted to show how that phenomenon is justified from the standpoint of the rule of law itself. So that's the general project of the book. And what I've sent you is the chapter on distributive justice, which is the chapter that deals with the first of these three issues that I mentioned the book is concerned with. And what I'm trying to do in this book is, in a sense, push private law, push the theory of private law right up to the boundaries of public law, right up to the border between private law and public law. For many years, I had the impression that I was looking up a mountain and I could see what was on my slope of the mountain of private law. But then over the top, down on the other slope, is public law. And I didn't have a clear view of what was involved in public law. And that was impeding my efforts to bring the two together. But over the last few years, I've done a considerable amount of work on the public law side. Not that I'm going to ever publish anything on public law, just to understand what the phenomenon is and what the parallel ideas in public law are that are parallel and complementary to the ideas of private law that I'm putting forward. And that's what the nature of this book is is aiming at. So let me first of all deal with corrective justice, with the setup to corrective justice. And for that, I'd ask you if you could to look at this sheet that I distributed, because I just want to go through the sheet in a very quick way so that it can serve as the jumping off point for what I'm going to say about distributive justice. So these are 14 theses about corrective justice. So they're 81 theses short of the famous theses that Luther nailed to his door. But I'm, in a sense, sure that if I worked at it, I could get these 14 theses up to 81. But they seem to me to be 14 propositions that sum up what the nature of corrective justice is. So proposition 1, thesis 1, liability corrects an injustice. A finding of liability corrects an injustice. I take it that that's not a very controversial thesis, except if one has some sort of special interest in putting forth some less plausible theory. But that seems to me to be simply obvious that the point of liability is to correct an injustice. And my point in these 14 theses is that if you grant me that first thesis, the other 13 will follow. That is, are not naturally developed from it, but actually follow from it. So I want to just go through that those other 14. 2, liability is a correlatively structured phenomenon. The liability of a particular defendant is always the liability to a particular plaintiff. That's just an obvious statement about the nature of liability. 3, the injustice corrected is correlatively structured. That just follows from 1 and 2. That is, if liability corrects an injustice and liability is correlatively structured, then the injustice corrected is correlatively structured. 4, injustice is not a brute event, but a normative description on the basis of reasons. 5, the reasons for considering something an injustice are also correlatively structured. That seems to follow from 3 and 4. 6, the reasons are correlatively structured only if they employ concepts that are correlatively structured. That is, we reason through concepts. 7, right and the obligation correlative to it are the concepts that underlie liability. Those are the correlatively structured concepts. 8, the existence of the right and its correlative obligation is justificatory. It goes to the reason for liability and is not merely a conclusion attached to the finding of liability. So actually, let me just stop for a moment and pull my drapes because the sun is coming into my window. Yeah, okay. It goes to the reason for liability and not merely a conclusion attached to the finding of liability. That seems to follow for me from Thesis 4, that injustice is a normative description on the basis of reasons, and Thesis 7, that right and the obligation relative to it are the concepts that underlie liability. Then 9, the justificatory ground of the right, that is what accounts for the role of the right in providing a reason for liability under 8, is correlative to the justificatory ground for the obligation. That follows from 5 and 8. Then the justificatory ground for the right cannot, this is a negative statement, cannot consist in the welfare of the right holder that the right holder realizes from the right's existence, because welfare is not a correlatively structured concept. Welfare is a concept that deals with a particular person's welfare, but doesn't relate any particular person to any other particular person. So that statement, the justificatory ground for the right cannot consist in the welfare that the right holder realizes from the right's existence, that seems to me to follow from Thesis 5 and 9. And if that thesis is correct, that is, Thesis 10 is correct, it shows, by the way, that the whole interest theory of rights must be wrong. So that's actually a controversy that I referred to in an earlier part of the book, to show that where I try to outline the conception of a right and say that on the basis of reasoning like that in Thesis 10, that the interest theory of rights is incorrect. Now, to be honest, I also have comments that say that the will theory of rights is also incorrect. But that's a different argument. As I say, that I do have a chapter in the book, an earlier chapter, that deals with what the nature of a right is. Anyway, Thesis 11 which is the most complex of them, and actually the most important for our purposes, the justificatory ground for the right, okay, so if it's not welfare, what is it? What is the justificatory ground for a right if it's not welfare? The justificatory ground for a right, the right, consists in the right's role in actualizing a legal regime of equal reciprocal freedom. That is, a regime in which one can act for one's purposes, whatever they are, so long as one's actions are consistent with the equal freedom of others to act for their purposes. So this is a Kantian idea, and I, in Thesis 11, quote the sentence of Kant that inspires this particular formulation, where Kant says, early in the work of the Doctrine of Right, the concept of right is the totality of conditions under which the action of one person can coexist with the freedom of another. That's an assertion of the paramountcy of equal reciprocal freedom in our understanding of what a regime of rights is. So within a legal regime of equal reciprocal freedom, the parties are correlatively situated as interactor and interactee, my word I've made up, on terms of equality. That is, equal reciprocal freedom provides the conditions under which Thesis 7, right, and the obligation relative to it are the concepts that underlie liability, conforms to Thesis 9. That is, the justificatory ground for the right is correlative to the justificatory ground of the obligation. So Thesis 12, I want to come back to Thesis 11 in a moment. So Thesis 12, within a regime of equal reciprocal freedom, rights are adverbial. That is, they govern how persons are to go about pursuing their self-chosen purposes, not what their purposes have to be. So one can do whatever one wants, but in doing whatever one wants, one has to act in a way that conforms to the rights of others. So it's that's what I mean by saying rights are adverbial. The various kinds of rights, this is just talking about rights in general, as understood within a theory of corrective justice. But of course, there are various kinds of rights: property rights, contractual rights, rights to personal integrity, and so on. Rights, fiduciary rights with respect to fiduciaries. The various kinds of rights are the juridical conduits through which persons interact on terms of their equal reciprocal freedom. And that leads to 14, an inconsistency with the plaintiff's right that is imputable to the defendant is an injustice that liability can correct. So 14 brings us, in a sense, back in a huge circle to Thesis 1. So Thesis 1 was liability corrects an injustice, and 14 fleshes out what one means by an injustice from the standpoint of corrective justice. So the whole of these 14 theses have gone around, as I say, in a circle, arriving back at their starting point, but with greater specificity. Now, so much for the corrective justice setup. Now, let me turn to distributive justice, which is the particular material that I asked you to read. And it will not surprise you that I am going to have put forward in this chapter, a Kantian argument for distributive justice. Now, I think this, I find this could clear up a misunderstanding about corrective justice theory that some people have said and written, oh, Weinrib is a libertarian. That is, he just believes in private legal relations. And that is actually not true. I am probably I suspect from what you can gather in this chapter, farther to the left than most of the people who accuse me of being a libertarian. So I think this Kantian argument about distributive justice is worth making. So I start with Thesis 11, that sentence from Kant: the concept of right is the totality of conditions under which the action of one person can coexist with the freedom of another. And the principle that emerges from Thesis 11 is the principle that one's action should be capable of coexistence with the freedom of another, which is Kant calls the universal principle of right. And this is an objective principle. It's an objective principle. It's what in the old literature, as I was remarking to some of you, I'm now thoroughly immersed in the 16th century Spanish legal philosophy. In this old literature used to be called an objective right. This is a concept of an objective right, the idea that action of one has to coexist with the freedom of others. But corresponding to this objective principle of right is a subjective right, namely independence, the right to be independent from the constraint of another's will. That is, one can't imagine the action of one person coexisting with the freedom of another unless each person had a right to be free from the constraint of the other person's will. And that right is what Kant calls an innate right, the innate right. And I want to talk a bit about this innate right. So the negative formulation of this innate right is one of non-subordination to others, independence from the constraint of another's will. But there's also, as I point out in this chapter, a positive formulation, that is, the right to assert oneself in one's relationship with others, that is, to make one's way in the world on one's own terms, to carry on one's life on one's own initiative and responsibility. And that's what Kant, adopting the Roman term, calls being sui juris, being one's own master. So it has these positive implications of asserting oneself in one's relationship with other. One cannot be subservient to another. This right, this innate right, operates reciprocally. That is, its exercises are limited by the similar rights of others. Now, I say, and Kant says, this right is innate. And I want to comment on what that means. The right is innate in the sense that everyone, we all possess this right by virtue of our existence, by virtue of being born. That's what innate means. By virtue of, we all possess this right. And the particularly legal significance of this is that this is not a right that requires an act of acquisition. So many of our rights do require acts of acquisition. Say, my right to my pen, it's not my pen unless I've performed an act of acquisition with respect to that pen. But the innate right is not of that sort at all. There is no act of acquisition. And indeed, one cannot conceive of there being an act of acquisition for this right, because any such act would have to be the act of one's body. And one's body is the locus of one's innate right. So it requires no act of acquisition. And I think that's the crucial point from a legal perspective. And that's the point that I want to dwell on for the next few moments. The locus of the innate right is the body, which is the organ for the execution of one's independent purposes. That's the paradigmatic locus. There are other sort of implications of this right as well that I want to ignore today. So this right, this innate right, is fully conceivable in terms of reciprocal freedom in a bilateral world of individual transactions. Let's imagine that we lived in a world where our only relations of a juridical sort with other persons was bilateral and consisted in individual transactions. This right would be fully conceivable in that world from the standpoint of reciprocal freedom. That is, I would not be able to impinge on your body, you would not be able to impinge on my body. So this, what I'm calling this bilateral world of individual transactions is what Kant calls the state of nature. The state of nature, that is an imagined condition in which there are no institutions. Because what institutions do, legal institutions do, is that they don't join us bilaterally to one another, a series of bilateral relationships. They join all of us to all of us. In Kant's words, they're omnilateral. And the world of omnilateral relationships is the world of the civil condition or the state. But the innate right is, as I say, fully conceivable in terms of reciprocal freedom in a bilateral world of individual transactions. Now, such a world wouldn't be a very attractive world. I'm not saying it is. And it would be very difficult to operationalize this right, because even in connection with one's right to personal integrity, one still needs interpretation of what personal integrity means and means of enforcement of that right and so on. That's all true. That's all true. But the right itself is fully conceivable in that world, even though it can't be operationalized in such a world. So, in the state of nature, persons cannot be related to each other through things, but only through their bodies. They can't be related to each other through things because things require acquisition, and acquisition plays no role in innate right. That's the defining feature of an innate right, that it's not acquired. So that in this world of bilateral, in this bilateral world of individual transactions, no one can make a rightful demand on another with respect to a thing, because people are not related through things. They're related only through their innate rights, which involve no acquisition. And a thing always, and one's legal relationship through things always require acquisition. Now, okay, so let's talk about acquisition. This situation that I've described of rights being fully conceived from the standpoint of reciprocal freedom in a bilateral world of individual transactions makes property a problem. And the introduction of property changes that world. That is, if property is going to be introduced, that conception of the world has to be changed. And for Kant, the possibility of owning property is itself a requirement of freedom. This is, again, an argument that I trace earlier in detail, earlier in the book. But property is not fully conceivable in terms of reciprocal freedom in a bilateral world of individual transactions, because property involves acquisition, and acquisition is not conceivable in a bilateral world of individual transactions from the standpoint of reciprocal freedom, because an acquisition can be one person's unilateral act with respect to a thing that places everyone else under an obligation. And that is a violation of reciprocal freedom. So in the state of nature, there can be no acquisition. In this, Kant's view is diametrically opposed to, say, the view of Locke, who simply assumed that property could be a feature of the state of nature. Kant would regard that, I think, as nonsense. So what property requires is an omnilateral world. That is, a civil condition, a state, a civil condition. And the civil condition constitutes a public and systematic regime of property in a way that I'm going to explain in a moment. This civil condition is not a bilateral world of individual transactions, but an omnilateral world that includes all possible transactions of everyone over time. Since what the civil condition does is it relates everyone to everyone else and not through individual transactions, right? We're all related to each other through the institutions of the civil condition. Now, this makes possible a system of acquisition, because in the civil condition, we're no longer talking about bilateral relationships of individual transactions. All acquisitions taken systemically are the ground for the legitimacy of any other particular transaction, any particular acquisition. So the ground for my being able to acquire this pen, even though my acquiring this pen imposes an obligation on you and everybody else not to interfere with this pen, the ground of this is that I can acquire because you can acquire. I can acquire and you can acquire, not that there are a series of individual acquisitions, but the systematicity of acquisition mitigates its unilaterality. And thus, if there is to be property, and for Kant, there must be property, that's also a requirement of freedom. If there is to be property, there must be a civil condition. There must be a state. That's the way I understand Kant's argument. Others have understood it in a different way, but that's the way I understand it. So one can say the state creates property, and with it, that it creates property through its validation of acquisition, of the process of acquiring something. The state creates property, and with it, the power for any owner to exclude others from things, and thus the power to accumulate things, which was not a possibility in the state of nature. The power to accumulate things. This power to accumulate things is a consequence of the existence of the civil condition, that is the existence of the state. And this, of course, creates new possibilities for subordination. Now, what happens to the innate right in this omnilateral world? Well, the innate right has to adjust itself to the state's validation of property. That is, the whole point of the innate right on a Kantian view is to govern all legal relations, whether relations of private law or relations of public law. It's relevant to all legal relations. And Kant expresses this, as I mentioned in the chapter, by saying that when we enter the state, he's not thinking of it in temporal terms, he's thinking of it in conceptual terms, but he uses temporal language. When we enter the state, we give up our wild, lawless freedom and receive it back as freedom undiminished. Well, what is this freedom undiminished? It's the continued significance of innate right to the world of the civil condition. And this is what one should expect, because innate right is just the subjective right that corresponds to the universal principle of right. And the universal principle of right certainly continues in the civil condition. That's the whole point of the universal principle of right, that nothing can cause it to disintegrate. And so the innate right, I said, was a right to non-subordination, a right to make one's way in the world on one's own terms. This right to non-subordination and to make one's way in the world continue to apply. And this is on this account that I'm putting forward, the justification for distributive justice. The state creates the possibility of subordination, even in the absence of anyone wronging another as a matter of corrective justice. That is, if one person has accumulated and others are, and if one group of persons has accumulated and others are left without, then the state has created the possibility of subordination, even though none of those who are without or none of those who have accumulated have committed any violations of corrective justice. And so in distributive justice, the state alleviates this possibility and is under a duty to alleviate it. It's under a duty to alleviate it because it's under a duty to maintain the significance of the innate right. So that's why I say that this is as far from libertarian as one can imagine. I'm not saying that the state has the power to enact measures of distributive justice. I'm saying the state actually has an obligation to enact measures of distributive justice, though how that obligation gets then translated into legal terms is a matter that requires a certain development, which of course I don't go into in this chapter except in a very sketchy way. So that's the idea of distributive justice as it appears in this chapter. I've just tried to summarize it in against the background of corrective justice. Let me just make one more comment. I know I'm now coming pretty close, if I haven't already gone over the time that Diego allotted. And I want to say something about, just note the conception of unity, unity by conceptual sequence. I think, so I've tried to explain what this conception of unity is and how this conception of unity operates, even though corrective justice and distributive justice are completely different things. That's fundamental to my whole view of what corrective justice is, that corrective justice and distributive justice are categorically different. So how can there be a unity between them? Well, it can't be a unity of either one or the other because they're both forms of justice. And I think the answer lies in an idea of a unity by conceptual sequence. That is a unity where each stage of the sequence presupposes and complements the other stage, and the previous stage. It presupposes, so it can't intrude itself into the previous stage. That's why I don't think that in private relations, in the relations of private law, there's an obligation that poverty plays a role. That's the source of my difference from Diego in this respect. It can't go back to the previous stage. but it does complement the previous stage. I think this is a very distinctive notion of unity, which has been actually under-theorized, and I haven't given it a full exposition here. But I think it's the form of unity that is necessary for a theory of rights, that a theory of rights can have no other kind of unity to it. And that flows from what the theory of rights is. A theory of rights starts with a very broad conception of reciprocal freedom and the idea that reciprocal freedom can be instituted only through law. But what one needs then is a series of stages that specify what reciprocal freedom consists in. And this, as I note in the paper, in the chapter, a completely different process from instrumentalist accounts. So an instrumentalist account identifies some interest that stands apart from law, and then it's just a question of figuring out what corresponds with that interest. In the utilitarian view, what is the calculus that is necessary to produce the results? Whether law is involved in that is purely contingent. It might be, it might not be. But the interest is fully defined right from the beginning. And a theory of rights, that's not the way the theory operates. That's not the way any theory of rights, in my view, can operate. It operates by a process of going from an abstract conception of reciprocal freedom to more and more concrete specifications, determinations of reciprocal freedom. And my own view is that unless we can, and I'll just conclude with this thought, unless we can come to terms with the idea of unity by conceptual sequence, unless we can come to terms with that idea, we can actually make no progress in legal philosophy at all. All we'll be doing is continuing around in the old, with our old habits of saying, well, this seems like a good idea. People will have different versions of this good idea. They'll have different mechanics for institutionalizing this good idea, but it'll just be a repetition of what we've had basically for the last 200 years at least. And I think it's related to the triumph of positivism as well, but that's another story. That if we want to make progress in understanding law from a theoretical perspective, we have to confront the implications of reasoning through a conceptual sequence. So let me stop there. I'm sorry if I've gone a bit over, Diego, but that covers the points that I wanted to deal with. Thank you. I look forward to the
Thank you very much. I don't like virtual applause, so I will applaud with my hands.
Thank you. Thank you.
As usually, as we were in the same room. Okay, thank you very much for this illuminated presentation. And now we open the debate. We have some words already asked. And everyone who wants to make a question, please raise your hand. Esteban, you have the order, right? Who's first?
Henry, Alexander, and me.
Henry, please.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Professor. My question is related with the role of distributive justice and institutional role in maintaining independence. It is not clear for me that if also has an essential role in the content of corrective justice. Two situations come to my mind in this aspect. The first one is when it is defined that a typology of cases is regulated by a tort of negligence and no, but an objective liability or a regime of strict liability. Another, which seems even more complex to me, is the possibility of reducing the amount of damages for a situation of great poverty. Do you consider that these kind of cases, of these situations, there are arguments of distributive justice that affects the interpretation an adjudication of corrective justice? Is some connection there or is not? That's my question. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. And I'll answer it in two parts. In the idea of private law, I tried actually, and consistently since then, in other things that I've written about tort law, I've tried to put forward the idea that negligence does not involve distributive justice at all. That is, that negligence is a recognition of the equality of the parties. It's not, it doesn't involve distributive justice. So I would refer you back to that, there's a chapter in the idea of private law on strict liability. And I'd refer you back to that for the argument that negligence does not involve distributive justice. Now, your second question, your second example, I think is a very interesting example. My response is that I want to be consistent on this and say that corrective justice cannot admit the recognition of poverty, even in that example, because the plaintiff, let's say, who has won his case, vindicated his right, the plaintiff is entitled to the fullness of his right to the extent that the law can make him whole or make her whole. So again, I would say there too, that consideration has no place in corrective justice. And by that, I'm thinking mainly of the common law system, and it may be different from your perspective. So what I'm saying is that the court, on its own initiative, cannot limit damages in that way. Now, but could a legislature command the court to limit damages that way? Yes, a legislature could. That would be distributive justice, as I say in the chapter. That's within the competence of the legislature. A legislature could enact distributive justice and make it apply as between parties. It actually often, even in the examples that I gave, often does so. So one of the examples that I gave in the chapter was the example of the legislation that regulates residential tenancies. So it's regulating what would otherwise be a private transaction in the name of certain distributive ideas. So yes, that would be possible. But what I'm and perhaps even desirable. But what I'm trying to set out with the theory of corrective justice is this: what is it that pertains to the relationship between the parties as a bilateral relationship? And my assumption is that the court can flesh a court, something again in the common law system, a court can flesh out what that relationship is and must flesh out what that relationship is, but can't go beyond the normative implications of that relationship. So I think in your question, Henry, I think I'd be inclined, in the absence of any legislative adjustment to say, no, to maintain this hard line that distributive justice as such cannot figure in a corrective justice relationship.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Diego. We are really excited of having him today, Professor Weinrib, today with us. I think Professor Weinrib is one of those academics that you must read if you want to learn about philosophical foundations of private law. So thank you, Professor, for being here. I have only 2 questions regarding your exposition and the chapter you sent us. The first one is about the order of the sequence that you defended. If I understand well, we have in the state of nature a form of justice that is corrective justice that have a main role. And then in a civil state, besides this, we have distributive justice completing corrective justice. Yeah? But I think at least in 2 ways in which we can flip the order and put distributive justice in first place. The first one is by thinking in dignity as a criteria of distribution. If we said that as human beings, we have innate rights, for example, to our bodily integrity, we are embracing a kind of naturalism. But that naturalism could be understood as the result of a kind of distribution. We can think that God, nature, or whatever you want to think, is the distributor of that dignity. But even if we don't accept that this form of naturalism is a result of a distribution, we can think in the adjudication that judges and legislators make every day as a form of distribution. This is the second way for changing the order of the sequence. I think, in other words, I think that every time that a judge or a legislator is what you say or what you call specifying corrective justice, they are really distributing rights. At least I'm taking these ideas from some readings from Diego and John Garner. And my second question regards to the normative standing of need inside this sequence, namely inside the corrective justice relationships. We can think that the needs of people are a matter of concern in distributive justice in a civil state. But both distributive justice and corrective justice are unified by this value of to protect the independence of the will of the person from constraining will of others. In that sense, why corrective justice cannot deal with needs of people if that needs can affect the will of a person and their independence at the very beginning of an interaction. Maybe this is more visible or more evident in contract law, where in some cases here in Colombia, contracts have no validity when a part take advantage of a person that is in a state of extreme poverty, for example. To summarize, the question is, why not is a measure of distributive justice to say that a contract have no validity when one person is taking advantage of a person in extreme poverty, for example? Thank you, Professor Weinrib.
Good. Thank you for those very challenging remarks. So there's one word that struck me when you were asking your question, where you talked about nature as the distributor of dignity. And I acknowledged, and I think it's evident in the chapter, that innate right does, Kant's idea of innate right, which I'm making such use of in this chapter and actually throughout the book, Kant's conception of innate right is simply the philosophical expression of what in contemporary law we refer to as human dignity. So you say you refer to nature as the distributor of that dignity, and that these rights, you say nature is really distributing the rights. Now I have a hesitation about talking in terms of what's really happening, because I'm wondering what kind of assumptions about reality are actually behind that. But let me illustrate that with reference to distributive justice and what distributive justice is. So when I was talking about corrective justice, when I was dealing with the 14 theses, I talked about the role of justification in corrective justice, that the justifications have to have a certain shape. Now, when one comes to distributive justice, I think the same applies. That is, the justification for the distributive arrangement has to have a certain shape. It has to have the shape of a distribution. So my question is for these distributive, for whether when you say nature is the distributor of the dignity, my question is, well, what's the justification for the distribution? What justification allows us to see it as a distribution? And so this point that a distribution consists not in a certain result, but in a certain set of justifications, is something that holds for distributive justice. The role of justification holds for distributive justice as much as it holds for corrective justice, though, of course, the structure of the justification is different. But in each case, there has to be a justification. And so I don't know how one could sustain the view that nature is the distributor of the dignity. It may be that nature is bringing the dignity into existence, right? That is, to take an example of innate right. Innate right, right, is innate. It arises when we are born. We are born with innate right, unless we are born. If we're not born, we don't have it, right? Only people who exist have it. People that don't exist do not have it. But that's not the same as saying there's any distribution involved, because the question is, what is the justification for thinking of this right as innate? And the justification for thinking of this right as innate is not a distribution. It's that it is simply the subjective right that immediately falls out of the universal principle of rights, which is not a distributive principle, though down the sequence, it can give rise to distributive principles. Now, so let me just go back to your example, which is a very interesting example of contract law. And I can speak only as a person whose intellectual life has revolved around the common law rather than the civil law, rather than the law of different civilian jurisdictions. And I'm sorry for this shortfall on my part. So the common law has such doctrines as well. Doctrine of unconscionability, that is, that unconscionable contracts can be voided. And many people have said, well, this is an example of distributive justice operating in contracts. So it's a similar, I mean, in your question, in the formulation of your question, you related it specifically to poverty. Fair enough. And unconscionability goes beyond poverty. And people have said, but it's a distributive principle that's in the heart of contract law. And I can understand that view, but though I don't agree with it. I think it's possible and indeed necessary to understand doctrines like that in terms of corrective justice. That is, in terms of a set of corrective justice notions, including the idea of what kind of equality is relevant and how one judges that equality in terms of benefiting others in a way one didn't intend to. And so the best treatment of this that I know of, and I think it's an exhaustive treatment, you might want to look at it if you haven't already, is by Peter Benson in his view, Justice and Transactions, this massive book on contract theory, wonderful book on contract theory, where he discusses unconscionability at length as a non-distributive idea, And the basis of this is, if I can sum up what I think the main point is that people are not presumed to give gifts to other people. One can give a gift, but one has to intend to give a gift. And a gift is given whenever one exchanges something, whenever the exchange is marked by an inequality of value. That inequality of value has to be intended. And if it's not intended, then it doesn't lose its status as a gift that is not intended and therefore has no juridical effect. That is now that may not be that may not be the kind of explanation that appeals to you, which is fair enough. A lot of people don't accept that, but that's an example of a kind of explanation that entrenches even that kind of doctrine within corrective justice and denies the significance of distributive justice. And I've tried the same strategy, not here in this book, but in my book on corrective justice, in connection with unjust enrichment. So some people have said, well, unjust enrichment is takes hold when the court sees that one person's welfare is been badly affected by a transfer. My friend Hanoch Dagan has a view of that sort. And he also uses that view in a way similar to the point of your question. This shows that corrective justice can't account for that. But corrective justice, in effect, does account for that. At least I think it does. By saying that if one gives another a benefit without intending to do so, then the benefit has been unjustly transferred and can be reversed. So that's something that I've written about at length in my book, Corrective Justice. The longest chapter in that book is about unjust enrichment. But it's again trying to deploy concepts from the repertory of private law concepts to explain these ideas that some people have associated with distributive justice. I don't associate them with distributive justice, and I think this non-distributive view, at least in the case of unjust enrichment, which is what I'm most familiar with, this non-distributive view is actually truer to the law than the distributive view. So that's where, that's not a full answer, Alex, that's not a full answer to your observations, which are very pertinent. But that's the line that I would explore if I were trying to flesh out an answer to the points that you raised.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the next one is Nacho.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your exposition, Professor. Well, first of all, I must confess I'm a bit of a groupie, so if I giggle every now and then when I'm asking my question, please forgive me. But yeah, so I really liked your exposition, and I really liked your chapter, and I liked the sequence way of explaining the unity. But well, my question relates to Alex's question as well on the order between distributive justice and corrective justice, but from a different point of view. It seems to me that if distributive justice comes after corrective justice, then necessarily distributive justice would have a lexical priority, using Rawlsian terms, over corrective justice, because if distributive justice is there to correct corrective justice, to put it in a way, imagine if Karen Pass were correct, and even if tort law embodies corrective justice and is just on corrective terms, but it turns out that it reinforces a distributive injustice, we would have to get rid of it. So we would only have corrective justice as long as it is just on distributive terms, if I'm making any sense. While I believe that if we change that order, and I also feel like it's more how it works on reality, that we already have a distribution, which might be just or unjust, and then corrective justice works on that, especially tort law, which I know you're not trying only to explain tort law, but maybe tort law is the best example. And Diego might have a better explanation of how that works. But what I'm trying to say is that if corrective justice comes after distributive justice, then it doesn't have to have total priority, because corrective justice could work to enforce just distribution on those terms. So yeah, that would be my question. And thanks so much again for being here.
Thanks for your comments. So so let me start with something you said toward the end of your comment, that you say, well, corrective justice operates in a world where distributions have already been made. Let me say that is true, that corrective justice operates in a world in which distributions already have been made. I'm not sure it's true, but let me just assume that it's true. The reason I'm not sure that's true is because that would seem to involve that all property holdings are matters of distributive justice. And I don't believe that. Though some of them could be, I don't believe that. But anyway, let's say that that's true, that corrective justice operates in a world that has been already completely distributed as a matter of distributive justice. The question would still arise, and now some dispute arises about between parties with respect to those distributed goods. The question still arises, well, how is that dispute resolved? And I think the answer is, well, it's still resolved according to corrective justice. And remember, and this goes back to what I was saying to Alex, remember that my view is that what matters for both distributive justice and corrective justice is not the fact that there's a distribution or the fact that there's a correction. What matters is the justification for the distribution or the justification for the operation of the correction. In what terms is that dispute justifiably resolved? And my response would be that dispute is justifiably resolved in terms of, that is, using the justifications that flow from corrective justice. Even though the things that people have, they may have as a matter of distributive justice. But once they have them, any dispute between persons is resolved by reference to the justifications for corrective, for having a correction in accordance with corrective justice. Let me go back to the main body now of your question. So you put it in a very striking way. You said distributive justice has lexical priority over corrective justice. And I would actually dispute that, even on your account. That is, a lexical priority does not come from the question of who has the last word, which is what you were saying. You said corrective justice needs to be just in distributive terms, that distributive justice, you said, has the last word. I don't think that's what a lexical priority is about. Lexical priority is about the stages by which one works toward the last word. And I think the stages by which one works towards the last word is the sequence that I've tried to portray. That is, there's corrective justice as the organizing idea of relations, of bilateral, bipolar relations between persons. That idea does not exhaust the field of justice. Those organizing terms may actually lead to a world that defeat the possibility in certain circumstances of reciprocal freedom. Under those circumstances, the state should enact a scheme of distributive justice. The state, in enacting such a scheme, can actually do away with part of corrective justice. That's one of the points that I make. That is, can do away with tort law. And I give the example in the chapter of litigation involving workers' compensation in Ontario, where the plaintiff said, wait a minute, this is doing away with tort law. You can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And the court said, no, that's all right. Actually, I have to confess, I have a sort of personal stake in that litigation of a very indirect way, because my wife, who's a professor of constitutional law before she became an academic, used to argue the government's cases, the constitutional cases of the government of Ontario, and she was defending the legislation against the demands of tort law. And to be honest, I thought she was absolutely right in the position she was taking. And I'd like to think I thought she was right, even though I was married to her. So it may well be that the legislature does away with a part of tort law or some other part of private law. And that's what I specifically contemplate. But I think it can only do away with it on the basis of this judgment that the corrective justice arrangements are inadequate from the standpoint of reciprocal freedom. And that means that the corrective justice arrangements have a lexical priority, that is, one considers them first, but one may end up in some other point. If you had it the other way around, that distributive justice is first, then I think one gets into very odd situations that are actually not untopical. That is, that would mean that one's innate right is also a matter of distributive justice. And that raises the picture that somebody, you call it nature, is looking around at the world and saying, well, I have all these people, I think I'll distribute innate right to all of them. And then when the government takes over nature's role, it says, well, I can distribute innate right to everyone as well. And I think in a sense, that's actually in a way in play with our neighbors in the United States, where they're saying, well, you can't actually force people to have injections, right? And of course, it's phrased a bit oddly there because the government is not actually forcing anybody to have a vaccination. It's just saying, unless you have it, there are certain things you can't do, certain interactions you can't have. But the idea that innate right would itself be distributed seems to me to be a very difficult idea. So I would maintain that I'm glad the idea of a sequence appeals to you, but I would maintain that the sequence is, as I set out, rather than with the priority of distributive justice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Esteban?
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It is a real pleasure to discuss this issue with you again. The first time was 2 years ago in Toronto. I only have two very short questions. The first one is about the relationship between the coherency of the private law system and distributive justice. Distributive justice affects or not the internal coherency of private law. I think you have changed your position on this point in the relationship, the idea of private law. The second one is about the place of corrective and distributive justice in private law. Corrective justice may have lost in a permanent place in some areas of private law, such as consumer law, labor law, and family law. How is it possible to fit these areas into the general system of private law? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Could you just repeat your first question again? Because I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, the first question is about the relationship between the coherency of the private law and distributive justice. Because the problem is distributive justice affect or not the internal coherency of the private law.
I see. Okay. So, yeah, so on the first point, to the extent that there are distributive arrangements in private law, they do disturb the coherence of private law, or they disturb its comprehensiveness, at any rate, the comprehensive coherence of private law. And that's why, right, the conclusion I get from that, I draw from that, is that coherence requires us to exclude distributive considerations from private law, especially if one's talking about private law made by judges. That is because the judges, in my view, don't have a mandate to distribute anything. They only have a mandate to adjudicate rights. But as I said in response to a previous question, the state, through its legislative action, may have reasons to cut in to the comprehensiveness of private law for distributive reasons. That's something that I expressly allow. because that's simply what the nature of a sequence is. If the state didn't have such a competence, then the sequence would come to an end prematurely, and it would mean that reciprocal freedom could not be adequately realized. Now, having said that, I have to confess I've actually now also forgotten your second question. So I was wondering if you could just quickly repeat that. I'm sorry, Stephen.
No problem. The second one is about the place of corrective justice and distributive justice in private law, because corrective justice may have lost its permanent place in some areas of private law.
Yes.
Such as consumer law, labor law, family law.
Yes, I think that's right. I think you're right that it has lost its place. And I have to say, from my point of view, that that meant that. One can have the views that I have, I think, about the coherence and fairness of corrective justice in terms of a bilateral relationship, and also have the views that there are situations where the legislature has to intervene because, from the standpoint of non-subordination of reciprocal freedom, the corrective justice regime is either being misapplied in its own terms, or, even though being faithfully applied in its own terms, is leading to a situation where people are being subordinated to others. So yes, so I think in the chapter I expressly mentioned labor relations as an example. Other examples, as I say, in tort law, where there are areas of tort law that were formerly areas of tort law, which have just been removed from tort law. So workers' compensation is the example I use, where in Ontario, tort law is not even an alternative possibility for a worker to sue an employer. It all has to go through the distributive system, consumer relations, landlord and tenant relations, family relations. Yes, I think all these things, there has been an abridging of the scope of private law understood as corrective justice. But I think it's within my point in this chapter, of course, is that is within the legislative competence of the state, and rightly within the legislative competence of the state, if the operation of private law is itself acting to endanger the reciprocal freedom of all, this reciprocal freedom of everyone.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Maria Alejandra. She made it in writing. I will try to translate it. All right. Her question is about the role of corrective justice regarding emotional harm. And as I understood the question, it relates to two features: how corrective justice can play a role or be relevant in the process of healing the injurer, his bad character or his propensity to harm. And the other aspect of the question is related to deterrence, because in this kind of harms, emotional harms, maybe our most important concern, or what we care most about, is not happening them not happening again. So what will be the relationship between corrective justice and deterrence? I think Maria Alejandra, it's okay. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is actually a very complicated issue, I think, involving doctrinal details that I've, again, tried to deal with elsewhere, but they arise in this context as well. So let's go back to the innate right that I started with. And I said innate right is the right that one has, that doesn't require acquisition. And I gave as the paradigmatic locus of that right the body. And the question arises, well, what is the body? What is it? Now, our conception of the body actually changes over time. That's I think, evident. Of course, and again, I speak from a common law perspective. I'm sorry that I'm limited in that way. For a long time, emotional harm was not recognized at all in common law. And then over time, the recognition of emotional harms was recognized. So that means that they are recognized, I think, as belonging to innate right. And so the place of emotional harms is in an exposition of what the contemporary significance of innate right is. Now I say our conception of the body has changed. I think this is, and I say that there's nothing sinister about that, because the point of having a civil condition is that the civil condition deals with what is public, and what is public can actually be time bound. That is, public norms at one point can be different from public perceptions at another point. So I think that in emotional harm is recognized as innate right. And in a later chapter of this book, I have an extended discussion, a later chapter involving on horizontality. I have an extended discussion of the case of the religious protesters who would protest at the funerals of dead United States soldiers who had been killed in action. And the American Supreme Court found that that was just freedom of speech under very painful circumstances, but it was just freedom of speech. And I try to analyze that case by saying, no, this was not only an interference with the emotional, an infliction of emotional harm on the mourners. That was a negation of their rights, but it was an interference with the dignity of both, actually both the mourners and the deceased. And I offer the rather extreme possibility that, though may not be so extreme in the civil law jurisdictions, that the deceased actually have dignity. So I think that's where emotional harm fits in. Now, when we come to the second part of your question, which you say is related to the first, because you're particularly concerned with deterrence in the context, I gather, in the context of emotional harm. Again, I think there's not a problem about compensating for loss of dignity. And again, in the common law, we have a special branch of damages that compensates for loss of dignity over and above other losses. They're called aggravated damages. But the point of these aggravated damages is that they're not deterrence-based. They're regarded as compensatory. They're regarded as compensatory, though from the outside they may serve the same function as deterrence. Again, if one comes to deterrence, then again I'm going to, I fear, maintain my hard line on this. That is, deterrence, considerations of deterrence would have to be justified as considerations of deterrence. And such justifications cannot fit within corrective justice because considerations of deterrence are unilaterally directed at the defendant and are not relational. Right? That's, and I think many civilian jurisdictions recognize this, though I gather that the recognition is weakening because many civilian jurisdictions refuse to recognize punitive damages, which are expressly on a deterrent basis. And I take it that the reason for that is a corrective justice reason. That is, whatever the role of deterrence, it doesn't have anything to do with the relationship between these two parties. It has to do with future actions by the defendant. And that can't count as a matter of corrective justice.
Thank you very much.
Edgar,
Thank you for your question, Maria.
We are short of time, so make brief questions, please.
Oh, thank you, Diego. Thank you, Professor Weinrib, for your wonderful presentation. My question is the following: are there any limits, and how can we could articulate those limits if there are any, regarding the amount of distributive measures that a regime of corrective justice can take in? So it's basically that. Are there any limits to the distributive measures, and how is there a principled way, a theoretical way that we can spell out those limits? Thank you very much.
Well, that's very tough. You're saving all the hardest questions are the ones coming now, I guess, as well. That's very tough. And again, I'm inclined to say there are no limits if it's pursued on the grounds that I set out in the chapter. Now, remember in the chapter, I tried to argue toward the end, right at the end of the chapter, that the need for distributive justice arises in particular situations where where private law, understood corrective in terms of corrective justice, where private law fails to alleviate the dangers to reciprocal freedom, right? So it arises in specific circumstances. So part of that, and what those circumstances are, they'll vary over time from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and so on. But they're particular circumstances, and part of that is an attempt to actually avoid your question. That is to say, well, it's not that there's a general idea of distributive justice that supplants corrective justice. Distributive justice supplants corrective justice under particular circumstances where that supplantation can be justified in the terms that I've set out. And that's in a sense where the chapter ends. So that's a reaction to questions that I was asked many years ago when I was dealing more intensively with tort law, where people asked me, well, what if the entire tort system was abolished? And there simply was no tort system. And instead there was some other system. And the example that's held up in the common law world is New Zealand, where personal injuries compensation is abolished. And my answer at the time was, well, that's another question, and that doesn't affect the validity of the corrective justice itself. Now I've tried to flesh out that by saying, yes, that can happen if the circumstances justify it. Now, I don't know whether the circumstances justified it in New Zealand or not. I actually don't know. But that's ultimately a political decision. That is political in the sense that I explained in the chapter. That is not political in the sense of, oh, it's subject to the varying pressures of self-interest, but political in the sense that the political deals with the actualization of ideas of right. And that actualization can respond to different kinds of circumstance. So my inclination is to say that any replacement of private law by distributive justice has to be justified in the terms that I'm setting out. And that means that there's no blanket answer, no general answer to your question about limits. It depends on what the circumstances are.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Margarita?
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation and for the chapter. I really like it. A short question. You say that the part of the distributive justice is, well, the ones that can distribute the rights, it's the state, and you related to the legislative govern part of the government. But don't you think that even in a residual cases, the judges not only to adjudicate rights in a process, but sometimes it changes the distribution between the parties? And I will give you an example. In the European Court, there was a case whenever the peacemaker couldn't, in the case, the peacemaker couldn't be proved the defect in this case. So it was consulted by the European Court, and they said in their conclusion that the claimant only needed to prove the significantly increased risk of failure. So I changed what it needed to be proved in the case. So he didn't have to prove that the peacemaker was defective, but only his significantly increased risk of failure. So in this case, it changed, or at least the concept of the defect, it was extended, and for the rest of these past cases, because it wasn't for all implant products, but just a few of them, changed the distribution. So don't you think in this case, for example, the judge did change the distribution? So is doing this work that is not only for the legislature. Thank you for that.
That's a very interesting question, an interesting example. And I would appreciate it if you could actually send me a reference to that case. I'd be interested in pursuing your question. So this is, again, a very, very difficult problem about whether proof of an increase in risk can be substituted for proof of injury itself, right? Which is what the question. They couldn't prove that this pacemaker actually injured in the sense that that otherwise this event wouldn't have happened, but they could increase the, but they could prove that it significantly increased the risk, and the court held that was sufficient. So this depends again on how you justify that result. And I've actually written on exactly that problem. Not in this, it's not part of this book, but a couple of years ago, not long, I published an article on causal uncertainty in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, in which I considered several cases, several different scenarios of causal uncertainty. There are different, of course, as you know, different scenarios under which this problem of the inability to prove that the defendant's action caused the injury, where that arises. And so I considered several of these examples. And one of them is actually the very example that, not the very example that you gave, an example related to the example that is similar to the example that you gave. And it might be worth, if you're pursuing this, it might be worth looking at that article. It's in the, as I say, in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, a couple of, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I've forgotten, not long ago. And I try to set out, in this, and it's a very complicated discussion, I try to set out why that result can, under certain circumstances, be justified as a matter of corrective justice. My goal in that article was to say, well, there are a number of situations where this causal uncertainty problem arises. And they're usually taken to be situations where corrective justice can't apply, because corrective justice seems to require that the defendant have injured the plaintiff. That seems to be a basic element of the paradigm. And my point is that there are some circumstances where one can allow for liability in the absence of proof of the final, of causation of the final injury, where one can construe the defendant as having infringed upon a right. And that requires a very, I'm afraid, fairly complex reasoning about what the right is. And so I would refer you, instead of my trying to reproduce the argument of that article, I would refer you to it. I still believe that article, though the hesitation that I have about that article is that it may be too complicated. That is my whole reason for appealing to corrective justice from the beginning is that, well, corrective justice is pretty simple. Everybody can understand corrective justice. You don't need any special insight into it, though it poses certain theoretical problems. But as an idea, it's a pretty obvious idea. And one can, so here I'm offering a series of very complex explanations that involve, in each circumstance, trying to identify exactly what the right is with which the defendant has interfered, even if the plaintiff cannot prove on a balance of probabilities that the defendant has caused the final injury. So anyway, maybe that's the best I can do here, unless Diego wants to give me another 2 hours. But anyway, so I'd refer you to that. But I think it's a very, very interesting question, and if your work revolves around that question, I think that's really important work.
Thank you. Not 2 hours, but I will ask you just a few more minutes. The last question is on me. I mean, I'm the moderator. I have to be at the end. So I have a few
Yes.
questions. I had like 10 questions in the paper. I chosen 4, but I'm going to limit myself to 2 because we are running out of time. My first question is related to the state of nature, how it is defined. And I don't see exactly, in a purely state of nature, there is nothing that I owe to you. In a sense, there is pure force. But we have a doctrine of natural rights, and you say, well, we have some innate rights, right, that I have just for the fact of being born. But those rights are limited to my physical integrity. I cannot even touch you without your consent. But besides that, there are no other rights like property, nor a right to be helped by anyone, not even a reciprocal help principle, like even if it is a easy rescue cases, nothing like that. I don't see that so clear. I think that the construction of the native stature is normative laden. So we should discuss about which is the proper conception of what we owe to each other in terms of scanlon in the state of nature. Think of this example. Suppose that I respect all your physical rights, but we live together in a community and we start trusting each other. So we collaborate from time to time, voluntarily we collaborate. And one night I take everyone by surprise by burning all our common harvest. So there is complete certainty that we as a community are going to die during the winter because of what I did. As is this defined the state of nature, there is no distributive injustice in what I did because distributive justice does not apply, nor a corrective justice. I haven't done anything wrong to any of you because I haven't touched your body. I just burned all the food we have, and it's the product of our joint work. So that seems implausible to me. I think that there's room to discuss what the proper considerations to introduce maybe distributed considerations or other principles other than do not touch me without my consent. This is my first question. And if that is possible, maybe distributed considerations can also be part of the discussion and the strategies to break the 2 stages argument, right? My second question is regarding the civil condition. Distributive justice enters into the picture because in the civil condition, new opportunities for subordination arise. I mean, now I can subordinate other people in a way that I couldn't before in the first stage, in the stage of nature. On the other hand, you claim that the scope for distributive justice is very broad. I mean, there are many purposes you can pursue with distributive justice, many goals that you can try to achieve with distributive justice, but I'm not so sure that that is so broad. For example, if my needs are related to the fact that I was born with an illness or with an incapacity, disability, physical disability, well, my needs, my current state of affairs, I mean, my inability to make a living in this world is not related to the system of rights in any way. I just was unlucky. So distributive justice should not apply because distributive justice is just a way to legitimate the system of rights and the externalities that the system of right produces. Sometimes the normal functioning of our private law rights generate poorness. Well, we need a distributive justice principle to solve that problem, because if not, the whole system of private law becomes in a way illegitimate. Well, but distributive justice, as we commonly understand it, applies to other situations like being unlucky in being untalented Or what if, for example, my condition, my economic condition is due to the fact that I made very bad choices in business. I gamble my money, for example. I'm entitled to any assistance in terms of social welfare or not. If the role of distributive justice is to supplement for the defects created by the same system of private rights, unless I'm not able to link my condition with the normal functioning of those private rights, I have no claim. So it doesn't fit the picture in the way we commonly or normally understand now. I mean, in the 20th century, how we understand distributive justice. So these are the two questions I've chosen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diego. So let me start with the first of your comments about the state of nature being a normatively laden construction. The construction of it is normatively laden. I think that's absolutely right. And that means that we can't look for some sort of abstract, and I think this is your point, some sort of abstract definition or characterization of the some sort of abstract characterization of the state of nature apart from the normative character that we're ascribing to it. And I agree with that completely, because otherwise, if I were to say, no, there is a state of nature, and this is what it is, otherwise, we would be entitled to ask, well, okay, so what's happened since that state of nature? And we'd be inquiring into historical developments. And I think the whole point of a Kantian approach is to say that history in that sense is not relevant. That is, we don't come by our obligations because of history. We come by our obligations because the nature of our obligations. So the question is, so what is the standpoint from which one constructs the state of nature? The only answer I can give that's relevant to my purpose is, well, we construct it in accordance with the normative, in accordance with the need to provide normative illumination to what our rights are. That it's directed to our rights, it's directed to what the significance is of reciprocal freedom, what the significance is of the idea that Kant calls reciprocal, the universal principle of right, that is, that one person's acts have to be able to coexist with another's freedom. It's from that point of view that the state of nature is constructed. So what is it that we're trying to see? We're trying to see what is conceptually implicit in a system of rights, and how do we think of what is conceptually implicit in a system of rights? And that's why when I set out, not in the chapter, but when I set out in my remarks, I didn't do this in the chapter, maybe I should have. I actually originally didn't refer to the state of nature. I actually gave a characterization of it as a bilateral world of individual transactions, a world constructed from the viewpoint of reciprocal freedom. That's the way I initially characterized it. And I said, oh, that's the state of nature. So there's nothing about the state of nature, as I'm sure we agree, is just an imaginative device that allows us to present certain things. So I thought that that characterization of a world of bilateral relationships, respecting individual transactions from the viewpoint of reciprocal freedom, was a serviceable way to try to get at what the status is of different rights. That is, and in particular, what the difference is between an innate right, the innate right, because there's only one, the innate right, and the acquired rights. And of course, this is important because for me in this project, because in this book, I'm going to go on to argue. Well, I start the argument in this chapter where I say, well, this is what modern constitutionalists call human dignity. I'm going to go on to argue that one can understand the phenomenon of the Drittwirkung, of the horizontal application of constitutional rights from the standpoint of Kant's innate right. So you're right, it is constructed from this point of view. And it is constructed, to be honest, to exclude your example. Right? It is constructed to exclude your example. Because if it were constructed to include your example, in my view, we wouldn't have the proper sequential illumination of the regime of rights. So I agree with you on that it's being constructively, normatively laden, and that means we have to identify the normative point of view from which it's constructed. But I stand by the idea that in order to understand the normative point of view from which it's constructed and the function that the state of nature is supposed to serve in clarifying what is involved in a regime of rights, is that we have to distinguish between the innate right and the acquired rights. That's why in the state of nature, as I call it, as Kant calls it, I'm excluding the example that you gave of burning down the gathered food. I'm excluding it not because I'm such a nasty person, but because that would not make, including that example would mean that it wasn't serviceable. The state of nature is not serviceable for the purpose for which I wanted to use it. Now, your other question is very interesting, and Diego, I have to acknowledge that I hadn't thought of that question, and so I'm grateful that you've raised it. But so what occurs to me now is to say this, that once the civil condition arises, its jurisdiction with respect to non-subordination is general. That is, its jurisdiction, its competence with respect to non-subordination is not limited by difficulties involving property, even though it gets that jurisdiction because of difficulties involving property, but it's not limited to that. And we know that's in a sense what Kant thinks, because otherwise we could ask your question about the whole civil condition. Why is the civil condition, okay, if innate right is fully conceivable in the state of nature, why does the civil condition have any jurisdiction over it at all? I mean, that's a question we could ask, not a question Kant asked. Kant assumed that once we have the civil condition can use, has competence to deal with all situations of non-subordination, whether they're the kind of situations that involve property or not. And even though it's the problem of property that creates the civil condition and creates the problem. I'll have to admit that I'll have to think more about what you're saying, but that would be my inclination now. That is to say, the civil condition has a jurisdiction, has a competence to deal with non-subordination, and to deal with subordination in any circumstance where it's presented. Now, of course, there are limits beyond the limits that I've stated, though they're implied by what I say early in the chapter. Distributive justice always involves judgments about the extent of the distribution, the extent and occasion of the distribution. So I give the example that, you might think that there's morally no distinction between subordination caused by medical conditions, as in your situation, and subordination caused by certain kinds of injuries. And yet, a decision has to be made as to whether the distributive scheme is to include all medical conditions or whether it's going to be limited to certain kinds of activities. These are inevitable decisions because distributive justice always involves the judgment of legislative action and also always involves issues of scarcity. That is, it's always going to be the case that there will be situations of subordination that will not be adequately handled by reason of lack of resources. And indeed, in the South African Constitution, some of these situations are specified and saying, well, these things, there should be an approximation to the extent that resources allow. But there always are then situations that might be excluded, some because of scarcity of resources, some because the recipient, the actions of the recipient are such that they can't be legitimately incorporated into a distributive regime without adverse social effects that are the concern of the civil condition, such as saying, that's your gambling example. So there are these kinds of limitations, but I think the competence, the jurisdiction, as it were, the normative jurisdiction with respect to non-subordination is not limited. It's not limited to the particular issue that called that jurisdiction into being.
Thank you so much, Professor Weinrib. We learned a lot today. We had a great time, and I think we are anxious to read the book and continue discussing. Thank you for your generosity.
Well, great. Thanks for your questions, and it's great to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you. We keep in touch.
Yes, by all means. And I hope, as you say, that in the future, we can do similar things in 3-dimension.
That was the idea, but
yeah. But it was great to see you to the extent that we could. That was good. That was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dave.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.